Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, and thank you for watching this weekly ag weather forecast for Ag Carolina Farm Credit and AgSouth Farm Credit. Now, in this particular video, we've got a lot we're going to try to unpack here. I'm going to spend some time just talking about recent precipitation patterns, and then I'm going to tell you why we've been in this particular kind of phase of the atmospheric flow. I'm going to ask some big questions right in through these tabs and through here as to where we think this is going to go into summer. So that's going to be an important part for you to watch. I'll then come back to the near term, give us a forecast over the next couple of weeks. We'll then look once more at the new long-range data from the European weeklies, getting us out to mid-July, and I'll finish it up with an international update. So that's my plan for today. I've left you on the U.S. Drought Monitor, which was just updated yesterday, and we look at this every Friday because we're trying to assess what the longer-term drought stresses look like across North America, specifically here in the U.S. And in the lower 48, we're currently at about 12% of the land area in D1 to D4 drought. And technically for the southeast, except for Florida, we are drought free. We just have a couple of areas of abnormally dry conditions, as you can see showing up there in that light yellow. Now, I'm going to make a case out of this as to what you can't see on the map in Mexico in just a few moments. But what I want you to notice is that in terms of drought area for the entirety of the U.S., the last time we were this low was back here in 2020. So spring of 2020 was the last time we saw that small amount of drought. And if you want to focus in just on the southeast, this is what your drought time series looks like going back to the year 2000. So again, it's area of the southeast covered in some form of drought, which is color-coded here. And we have questions, right? What drove these large drought episodes back in the early 2000s, or the 2006, 2007 into 2008? What about 11 into 12, or here in 16? We have questions as to whether or not we build into that. And I've made a case for you, right? It's going to have to be some sort of large southeast ridging. And big picture is right now, before I even get into the details, no model's predicting it at this point. But we have to know that it's always a liability in our forecast. So what are the models predicting? Well, if you look back from April into May and now into early June, so much of what they're about to show us is going to reflect where we have been. And if you just take a look at these statistics, which are precipitation ranks by climate district, it's pretty clear that there's a corridor in through here that's been exceptionally wet. So I'm saying that the predictions I'm about to share with you, all of those models were initialized with very, very wet conditions in this area. Now, as I look at it, you can see how dry it's been in parts of Florida versus how wet it's been in eastern Texas. We can take note of how wet it's been across the southern tier of Georgia, but there has been, if you look over the last 2 months, there is a drier area in parts of North Carolina that can't be ignored. Now, yes, lately it's been better in that area for precipitation, and this is why we don't have drought here. But just in the month of May alone through early June, near record wet, and actually record wet down here, record wet at places in the Mid-South, very, very wet in this part of the Corn Belt. And these things are going to influence where this longer-term precipitation pattern is going to go, because back at the beginning of all of this, back at the beginning of April, much of the Ohio Valley, the Mississippi Valley, the Missouri Valley was very dry. We were looking at decent soil moisture up until April. And then we've had a couple of pockets that have gone over drier. This is the newest soil moisture map as of June 7th. This is root zone soil moisture. But again, what I want to stress is with what I'm about to share with you, every long-range model was just initialized with wet conditions, very wet conditions in this area. Just stuff that away in the back of your head for a few moments. Now, if we look at just the last 7 days, we had some absolutely torrential rains coming through parts of AgSouth and Ag Carolina's territory here, some places picking up several inches in a short amount of time. But if you look back farther to your west, 7 days, repeated storms rolling through parts of the south, big storms that have rolled through parts of the Midwest. I mean, we've been extremely stormy this spring. We're going to talk about why that's been the case to give us what's already been well over 1,100 tornadoes reported so far this year. We're at about 165% of average on wind reports and 110% of average on hail. And speaking of hail, I don't know if you saw this, but I'm going to take you to Texas really quickly because you just got to see this. Back on June the 2nd, a storm that blew up here in the Panhandle near a town called Silverton, not only produced twin tornadoes here, but also produced some absolutely monstrous hail. And I want to thank Val Castor for giving this to the National Weather Service so I can actually show it as well. He's given us permission here. So on this .gov site, you can now see that might be the new state record holder for hail. Now, I know that's outside of your territory. I just need you to see this, okay? It was an absolutely huge storm system. So where did we get over the last 24 hours? Well, we watched the system finally exit the coast. It's offshore now, but it did locally drop some very heavy rain in Virginia, North Carolina, and also getting back into parts of Alabama, but mainly Georgia, getting into southern Mississippi, all the way down to New Orleans. But this low that's curling up here over the Great Lakes is a part of a bigger pattern shift that happened this week, including the opening of a large ridge into the west. Now, that ridge that's delivering all of this heat into the west can't stick around for long. It's breaking down, and we need to see what the implications of that are going to be in the longer term. So here we go. This is the long-range stuff I want to talk to you about. Now let's just sit and marinate in this map for a second, because what it shows you is the dominant factors in May. And our question is, did the factors that controlled May control June and July, and maybe even later into August? Because what it's been dominated by are these ridges, one sitting here and another sitting there. And to the north of it, the jet stream is screamed around the base of a trough in the Bering Sea, rolled over the top of this ridge, and just raced toward the south and curled around a low that is set right here, that one, in kind of the central part of North America. While this has been going on, there's been other factors, like ridging that's happened from Mexico over to the Caribbean, getting Florida. The Bermuda High, which normally sits here, is not there. It's split. There's a piece that's way up in parts of like the Canadian archipelago and the Hudson Bay. Another piece that extends all the way into like almost Scandinavia. See it here? Just kind of flip over on this side of the map. That's driven flow around that ridge into Ukraine and the Russian grain belts out of the northwest before it curled out around this trough. And that's the drier side of a trough, which is why we've seen such extensive drought developing in Russia's western grain belt and parts of Ukraine. I want to know, what do these pieces look like going forward? Because they've driven some pretty wild precipitation extremes, which you've already seen for the United States. But let's talk about Mexico, because the drought that's in Mexico right now is showing up as one to be considered historic. There's been wildfires down here in parts of southern Mexico for the last 2 months, all spring long. And if you just take Mexico on the whole, it's the driest it's been in the last 80 years. And we have questions as to how this drought influences the pattern along the southern tier of the United States going forward, and what it might mean even later for influencing the hurricane season. So all of that's ahead of us. We've now seen where May is, and we got to start to talk about what this could mean going forward. And here's the first thing. The MJO has lived here. That's where our best rising motion has been, right in this area. And as a result, kind of a complement to it, half a world away, we've had a lot of sinking motion in Central America and Mexico. These two things are changing right now. That's one thing that's changing. And this is a lid coming off of the atmosphere here, meaning that we have got to start to prepare, all in this area, for some tropical moisture to start to surge north. Am I talking about a hurricane? Not yet. I don't have evidence of that yet. But moisture is going to start coming into this area. And at the same time that that's beginning to shift, we have to ask what's going on in the North Pacific. So I want to show you something we've looked at in the past. It's called the PDO, Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And when I say decadal, let's just zoom in here, since 2013 and look at it. What we typically find is that it goes for about 5 years in a positive phase and then about 5 years in a negative phase. What's interesting about this recent kind of PDO signal is right here in May. Because in May of 2024, I had been anticipating that this was going to start to make the turn. And instead, May of 2024 dropped the bottom out of the PDO. And we need to understand what that means and what are the implications of that. So let me show you. In May, going back to 1940, if the PDO is negative, we tended to have ridges, one here and one there. Now, I just showed you that that's typically the case. There tends to be a trough to the north of it. This year it's a little bit farther to the west, but a trough to the north. Look at this, a ridge in Mexico that sometimes expands into the eastern United States. No Bermuda High. It tends to split part here and part there. Now, how close were we to this year? Well, the Mexican ridge was down here, and the loss of the Bermuda High sent pieces much farther to the north. And again, this trough this year is over there. So it's not fully a PDO-only signal. What I'm trying to say here is that the PDO, though, owns the lion's share of where we've been in May, and we want to know if it's going to own the lion's share of June and July and August. I'd say it's about 70% of the pattern. What's contributing the other 30%? Well, we need to get to that in a few moments. But to understand that PDO, what we're going to watch is these ocean temperatures. Because historically, when the PDO is negative, We are very warm here with cooler water lining North America. We tend to have a broad La Niña signal. We don't have that this year. We tend to be cool across the Atlantic. We don't have that either. That's why it's not fully in control of this pattern. But if we just say, well, what does a negative PDO mean for air temperature going into summer? It does not translate into major heat risk for the southeast. You say, why? Because normally it places a large ridge of high pressure over Texas, maybe New Mexico, maybe getting into Oklahoma, Kansas. And if it's there, it's not here. You see, what would dominate us is if the Bermuda high regained strength and then flexed to the west and hit us. But that doesn't typically happen when the PDO is negative like it currently is. So we tend to not see significant heat stress in summer. Now that does not mean, listen to me carefully, that does not mean because of this one thing we won't get hot this summer. We will get hot. I'm talking about the significant sustained heat stress scenario is lowered because the PDO is negative. On the precipitation side of it, that's where it also tends to be drier. We tend to not see a strong correlation with our precipitation patterns here when the PDO is negative. It tends to be drier here in the southern plains. Now, what do we have again right now? Here's the ocean temperatures. It's not just the PDO, which is this guy, and the cooler water here that's dominating. We have this La Niña attempt, even though I say attempt because it's not going to be a major factor till late fall, maybe winter, and the Atlantic. The Atlantic is very, very warm. So let's start to piece these things together. There's something called the Atlantic meridional mode, which right now is 3, almost 4 standard deviations above the average. What am I talking about? It's all this warm water and the resulting pressure and wind patterns that result from it. If you take a look at what that might mean, the Atlantic meridional mode tends to start to crank up in June and July and August, this transport of higher moisture into this area. And you're going, wait a minute, I see a drier signal for us. Nah, we got to be careful here because sometimes what happens is we start to pull that moisture into this area and the signal is just not very strong. I want you to know that the Atlantic meridional mode may play an influence on our early summer pattern, but will much more likely have a bigger influence on our hurricane season, which generally really starts to crank up once we get into the month of August. Now, we have one last factor, and that is going to be La Niña. I say La Niña understanding that we're not there yet. Ocean temperatures have continued to come down, but they're back down to neutral. They're not into La Niña. And the forecast, La Niña would be if it did that. It may be looking a bit more like this over time. So what does that mean? Well, if we end up developing weak La Niña conditions, that tends to mean greater drought risk here, not for us. I'm just pointing this out because I want you to understand that this long-term forecast for summer isn't calling for widespread massive drought because there's no signal to put a big dominant southeast ridge in the pattern. Now, it doesn't mean it can't happen. I'm just saying that today, as we analyze this, there's no signal for it. And right now, if we look at how strong La Niña is going to be, it's looking like weak. I mean, not even, maybe even getting out of ENSO neutral. You got to get below minus 0.5 for that to happen. And the newest forecast even trended less aggressive toward this. So what's the point? The point is I want you to understand this new forecast. And it's a very nuanced forecast. Because as you look at this map and just take it in, you're like, whoa, I don't want to see dry colors in this area. But I'm telling you, I actually can't give a full explanation as to why it's dry in there in the model. I do understand this kind of wet corridor, because that's what the models were just initialized with. Look at how wet the soils at the top are on June 1 when that model was started. We were a little drier here. And that may be the reason why, because soil moisture factors into these models in a major way. They're primarily driven by ocean temperatures and soil moisture. And so what are we seeing? Well, we're probably seeing the dryness here as a result of the PDO. We're seeing the wetness in this area as a result of the current soil moisture. We're seeing the wetness in this corridor because of the Atlantic meridional mode. And I'm just going to make a case for you. While this is what the model shows, what we need to think about is this. Let's just imagine 2 scenarios. One scenario is where the warm water stays here, and this all stays cool. That would most likely, this is not 100% correlation, but most likely anchor a ridge somewhere here. And we'd end up getting flow that comes around the northern side of this, and drive storms into our area. Now, storms are always hit or miss. Stormy hot summers tend to produce flash drought scenarios. We then would follow that up, if the ocean temperatures stay like this, with what will likely be an active hurricane season while we wait on the development of the Bermuda high. But there's a lot of heat content in this water, and the risk is there. Here's scenario number 2. Let's imagine that this warm water builds into the North Pacific and occupies this area. The major ridge risk goes back farther to the west. And what I start to think about here is how that ridge in the west starts to change the pressure pattern over the southeast. The farther west it goes, the greater the risk of having a southeast ridge develop. But as it stands, if that scenario plays out, I think we get a ridge that comes in here, but I still don't see a dry scenario for us. Like widespread major drought, like 2006 or 7. I'm just not seeing that. It's just not there. I don't have evidence for it yet. I'm waiting on knowing what the Bermuda high is going to do, because it is split and weakened and pieces are here and here, and we got to wait to see it come back. But as it stands, this is the information we've got going forward. That's my long-range analysis. That's what we're keeping an eye on now. And I'm just telling you, doing a scenario analysis on AgSouth and Ag Carolina's territory, our summer drought development risk on a wide scale, looking at the extremes here, is low. It's low at this point. Now, if that changes, we talk about it. But right now, that's what I've got for you. Okay, where are we going in the near term? Let's come back to that. Here's what the jet stream's doing. There's the big ridge that's in the west. It's not much, though, to talk about. It's going to get knocked out by the momentum flowing in the North Pacific. And we're going to see how that influences the pattern across the rest of the entirety of the U.S. No big Bermuda high. I don't see it out here, though. Do you? So where do we end up getting this pattern taking us? We have nothing on our all hazards weather map. It's all the heat. These are all heat advisories, heat watches out in the west. And as we take a look at it, the severe weather's out there as well in the Central Plains. That's today's risk. There's tomorrow, and here's getting into Sunday. We have some thunderstorm activity that might get over to us, but not much. If you just take a look at the radar, kind of take you back here from last night into early this morning, I'm playing it pretty quickly because these showers and storms work their way out, and they're gone. They're off the coast this morning. And so if we have a look at what this means, there they leave. There's going to be isolated chances for showers like we just normally get this time of year that pop up in the afternoon here, but there's no organized widespread precipitation coming through this evening on Friday and even playing into the weekend. On Saturday morning, while rain starts to move through my home state of Illinois, coming out of Missouri, that front really has a difficult time clearing the Appalachian Mountains by Saturday night, getting into Sunday. So we could see some scattered storms on Saturday night, maybe in this corridor. But what do you notice? This isn't major washout type rainfall events. Scattered storms is what we could possibly see a couple of times this weekend. Most of us are going to be drier this weekend. So then we get into the bigger picture. What about the following 7 days? If we look at it, our signal is overall drier for most of the next 7 days, except for what's coming out here. And that's why I said we got to watch the tropics. Because getting into the week 2 time frame, we really see some tropical moisture surging into our area according to the European model. Now, during the same time period, the jet stream flow just starts to crank across the northern tier of the U.S. I'm going to show it to you. Because as that large western ridge breaks down, that's what this index is showing, this is going to indicate more flow across the United States. So here's what it looks like. Upper level high pattern through the weekend into early next week. I mean, look at the broad trough that's sitting over us here. We'll talk about what that's going to do to temperatures in a moment. That's through the 10th. By the 11th and 12th, flow comes back. Trough sweeps through in this direction. And we got to ask, after the 12th, 13th, 14th, is anything coming up out of the tropics to get our attention? And some of the models, while they're returning all of this activity here, are starting to develop some low pressure in the Gulf of Mexico. And I need to see what that's going to do in terms of our precip. So over the next 7 days, this is what we've got. This is the artificial intelligence forecast. Maybe what we should do is just go back and say, well, what is the AI system doing just over the next 5 days? And as we look at it, see, we're relatively dry. We have chances for isolated precip, but overall, the wettest weather's back here. If you then look at the 7 day, look at this surge of tropical moisture. Is it in the national blend of models? Yes. Is it in the WPC? Yeah, but a little bit farther into Florida than the national blend. What about the European? Okay, 7 days out, it's trying to show this get to us. And finally, what about the GFS? Yeah, it's cranking through this area. That is a lot of model spread. And so you go, Eric, you just told me about a 3-month forecast and you don't even feel confident about next week. I don't. And that is the nature of this business. If you could see me right now, I'm smiling ear to ear because this is what I wake up to every single day. But we're going to try to diagnose it. And we're going to look at the differences in the models first. Now, if you noticed in this, these colors represent where the European model is wetter. This is where the GFS is wetter. The European model brings this surge in here, but the GFS is farther into Florida and then much wetter up here in North and South Carolina than the European is. So watch how that unfolds. On the left, GFS, that's the wetter model for the Carolinas. On the right, European, that's the wetter for Florida. As we play through this weekend again, the models are not going to show up on that isolated convection. Here's Sunday getting into Monday. Now, early next week, we know that we're going through much of the next 5 days drier, so let's get out there past 5 days. And you're going to see this. Watch the left image. This is next Monday, Tuesday. Monday, Tuesday. See how the GFS is trying to bring in this frontal boundary that by next Wednesday is kind of really soaking, next Tuesday into Wednesday, bringing a lot of wet weather here. Not to be found in the Euro. The Euro's got that front farther out to the open ocean and leaves it lingering here. So what happens is the GFS clears it all out by Wednesday night, getting into Thursday, and that's when the moisture begins to surge from the European model. See this? What a difference starting midweek next week. That's the time frame we're going to have to watch out most carefully for. Now, if we add it up and look at the next 5 days, as our chances of getting over an inch, we're limited. Only isolated storms and showers are all we've got. So that's through the next 5 days. But as I play you out and add out to day 7 and 8, this starts to really begin to increase. And all the way out to the next 10 days, we start to see our chances for precipitation improving. And it's really different model to model. You see, here's the day 8 through 14 forecast from the CPC. Take a look at the European, though. Much wetter than the GFS is for week 2. Why? Because the GFS cleared the front sooner and then developed something down here for Florida. Man, what a difference overall. So what are we doing after this? Well, I'm just going to tell you something. Because we've taken the lid off the atmosphere here, we're going to have to watch the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico carefully through the next, well, honestly, it's not just the next couple of weeks. It's the next 12 weeks as we work our way toward this hurricane season. But I just want you to see that there is indication of rising motion here. Okay, finishing this up with temperatures. Okay, no frost risk. I just like showing this map because it's finally great to see. Only at very high elevation is the temperature going to get to freezing. Today, overall, it's near normal, a little bit warmer than normal along the coast here for highs. Very hot in the west, very hot in Texas. Saturday into Sunday, it's finally on Sunday that our temperatures start to get about 2 to 5 degrees warmer than average. We then play this out into next week. Monday, though, brings in some cooler weather. So does Tuesday. By next Wednesday, we get back toward normal. Thursday, I mean, that's not a lot of major temperature deviations, right? I mean, if anything, we play the next 5 days on the normal to cooler than normal time frame side of things, As we see day 5 through 10, not a lot of heat stress. It's all here. Day 10 through 15, we start to warm back up again, though. Is that in the European as well? Well, there's day 5 through 10. And day 10 through 15 starts to show those warmer signals showing back up. But here's the question I've got. Can we come back to a quick review of this? If we stretch this out, let's go have a look at it here. We know that one thing is happening. And that one thing is that the westerly winds in the northern hemisphere as we go to summer are getting weaker. There's also a westerly wind belt in the southern hemisphere, about the same latitude just in the southern hemisphere. It's getting stronger. Do you know what it's kind of hard to pick out in this? Is where's the influence of the Bermuda High? It seems to be all driven by the Pacific, which that's common, but that's a weaker jet stream moving farther and farther to the north. And we've got questions as to what this is going to mean. So take a look at this. Over the month that starts June 15 to July 15, what are the models doing? They don't have drought stress shown up for us yet. Where did they anchor it? Here. You know why now. That's where the PDO signal suggests it should be. And at the same time it's doing that, take a look at what it's doing to the temperatures. Watch now. This is now. This is going into next week. Notice where the heat is really anchoring in the central United States through the middle of July. And that is all being driven by this PDO signal. So that keeps us away from excessive long duration heat. That keeps us away from long time periods of being very, very dry. and makes the greater risk here. That's the story that I wanted to share with you today. That took me a long time, but that's what we get to. Now, to finish it up, quick international update. We still are very hot throughout the Russian grain belt in through here. It's also very warm in much of South America. And over the next 10 days or so, we see the models trying to drive storms into this area. It's going to be very difficult to do that with that heat. Take note, though, watch Africa. Got to watch this carefully, because at some point in late June, maybe getting into July, we're going to start to see some African easterly waves coming off of this intense convection here. And it'll be the interaction of that with some Saharan dust, you know the narrative, right, as we work our way toward this hurricane season. All right, I'm going to leave you on this map and just shut up here and say thank you for giving me all your attention today, because we covered a lot, but you all have a great weekend, and we'll pick this up again next Friday. Thanks.